Okay, today it's Saturday, the 28th of August 2010. We are at the 4S annual meeting in Tokyo. And this is a series of presidential interviews. Wiebe Bijker was president from 2002 to 2003. And he is professor of technology and society at the Faculty of Arts and Social Science at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. And we will talk about his career, 4S, and the field of science and technology studies. My name is Nikki Vermeulen. I graduated at Maastricht University. Wiebe Bijker was actually my supervisor, and I'm currently working at the University of Vienna. So shall we start with the beginning of your life, or shall we start a bit later?
Okay, let's start with the beginning, because I guess I'm still quite surprised that I ended up where I am now. Yeah. Started out in engineering school, studying physics in Delft in the Netherlands, and that was in the 1970s. So in the beginning I was very sure that I wanted to be an engineer, but it was at the heyday of discussions about the cruise missile, nuclear arms, nuclear power. So towards the end of engineering studies, I was sure I didn't want to work for Shell or Philips or one of the big companies. And there was an opportunity to start teaching physics in secondary school, and I did that next to my studies, just as a sort of side earning. Though that was a big mess in the first year, I couldn't keep order in class, started to read newspapers, which the pupils loved. I mean, newspapers to myself, not to the children. So it was a big mess. But then they still couldn't find physics teachers the next year, so they begged me to stay on, and I stayed on, and then I started to like it. So I actually turned into a school teacher.
So starting with engineering studies and then being a school teacher as well. And how? Why did you choose to do engineering studies?
I guess because, my father was an engineer, and he was a coastal engineer, and I actually, that is what I wanted to do. I wanted to play with water. I wanted to make dikes, as I did in holidays in small streams. But then I didn't want to be in class with my father, and he assured me that I would do physics. That was so fundamental that from there I could go into civil engineering any time later. Okay. So it was a sort of detour to get into civil engineering and coastal engineering later.
Physics and then civil.
Yeah.
And then ending up in front of the class.
Ending up in front of the class and liking that and wanting to make my career there. But then just because of demography, the number of pupils went down, and I was sacked, being the youngest in the school. So I had to leave. And then I turned to an old, something that I had been doing during my student days. In those days there was what we call the science and society movement, particularly amongst science and engineering students in the natural science faculties, engineering faculties.
What years are we talking about here? Like era?
That is, it's still the 1970s. It started, I guess in some sense it started in the wild 1968, 1969 period, but then it took really off in the 1970s. Science students, young science staff, again, being involved in discussions about nuclear arms, the arms race, nuclear power, a little bit environmental issues, but only a little bit then. And that then took me to a kind of research position, half-time, because for the other half I was taking care of my then only daughter. My wife and I both worked half-time. And that research was basically a historical project about how innovations develop. And that, in a way, was the starting point for where I am now. And then again, that went a bit strange. It was a big project with, the plan was to study 60 innovations and do a kind of quantitative analysis. So characterize these innovations, then do a quantitative analysis and come up with a theory about technical invention and innovation. I didn't like that quantitative analysis. I had done my master thesis on a computer model, trying to understand the arms race, and so I felt that I knew the limitations of doing such a quantitative analysis, and I was unhappy with it. So I said, yes, I would like to do this, but only if we can get rid of the big quantitative analysis and turn it into a more qualitative case study. Now they agreed, and we ended up doing about, I think, 5 case studies. The bicycle, Bakelite, and the fluorescent lamp amongst them, but also the transistor and a big weaving machine. I did that together with Ellen van Oost, who is now still a professor at Twente University, where we then started. Now that went quite well. It was a small project, half-time for me. And then Ellen and I were going to present our very first paper at the very first meeting of EAST. EAST is the European sister organization of 4S, which was established then in 1982, I think. The European Association for Science and Technology Studies. That meeting was in Austria. My faculty had a little bit of extra money to hire some foreign scholar for half a year. So they said, well, to Ellen and me, see whether you see someone who would be interested to come and interesting for us to invite. So Ellen and I went there. We presented for the first time social construction of technology paper using the bicycle as an example. And there we met Trevor Pinch. And Trevor's contract with Harry Collins in Bath was about to end. And we got along quite well, drank a lot of pink champagne, what that particular region in Austria is famous for. And I asked him whether he would be interested. So that's when he decided to come over in his small Beagle. I still remember he then came on the first week of January the next year, 83. And we spent half a year together. And so I think that's the second sort of stroke of luck that we met in that project, and that really, well, that helped because it fused my history of technology work, the case studies of the bicycle and Bakelite with his sociology of scientific knowledge work, his particular work on neutrinos. So that then we decided to present that collective work Ellen, Trevor and I were doing. But we were very poor, so there was a conference in Paris, but we had only money for one person to go there. And then since in those days my French was a little bit better than Trevor's and Ellen's, I would go. The other reason is that I was not at all impressed by the big guys that I would be meeting there. Bruno Latour, Michel Callon, I think David Bloor was scheduled to be there. I hardly knew them, just coming straight from secondary school teaching. And I wasn't, by that time I felt comfortable as a school teacher, so I could give a talk. Trevor was much more nervous that I would blow it, because he knew all these guys and he didn't want me to make a mess of it, but then what could he do, because I was going there on my own. That went quite well. That was the first time that I met Michel and Bruno, and it was great. So then returning to Trevor, that is when we got the idea that actually maybe we should try something bigger, and maybe there is something in this merging of technology, studying technology and using SSK as a kind of conceptual framework. That is when we had the idea of organizing a workshop in Twente and inviting people from SSK, from technology studies. Actually, I should give credit to Donald Mackenzie there. I think that when that Donald Mackenzie said, well, you should include historians of technology more than the usual suspects from SSK. And with that in mind, when I went to my first 4S meeting, which was it was at Virginia Tech, I think in 1983. I should need to check that. Afterwards, I went to Penn to give a talk at Penn, and there met more explicitly with historians of technology. Specifically invited Ruth Cohen and Tom Hughes and this is something that I have to do again because I don't want to mess up names. So I have to think about the name.
And we are rolling.
So that is the beginning of SCOT. I mean, I was always hesitant to use that acronym, which actually was invented by David Edge when Trevor and I submitted the paper to Social Studies of Science. Then he said, you need an acronym. There is EPOR, the Empirical Program of Relativism, which was in the paper. So you need an acronym. And then in his slightly devious mind, he invented SCOT. Being a very proud Scotsman himself, you must. I mean, it was very crucial never to send it to Edinburgh, England. Edinburgh, UK was acceptable, but Edinburgh, Scotland actually would get a much quicker deal of that letter to David. So he invented the SCOT metaphor. Trevor and I liked it. And maybe at this moment it's good to put it in a slightly broader picture. Yeah. I think that I still think that I was then in that program that I started out as a student in the Science and Society movement.
And what exactly were you doing in the Science and Society movement?
I was criticizing my professors. Maybe that is the briefest summary. And crucial key phrases were social responsibility, military-industrial complex. We were accusing our professors of working, even without themselves knowing that, on NATO money and on research that was related to the military, and not thinking enough and not critically enough about what their research might be used for and where they were heading. So that was the big debate.
You wrote articles about it, or you did protests,
No.
or you went into conversations?
My own work was mainly within the university, arguing for a reform of the curriculum so that there will be more attention to these political issues and issues where what kind of context science was carried out in. The Science and Society movement was broader than only within the university. It also protested against nuclear power stations, and that part of the movement was not very successful. There were barricades built around, say, Dutch nuclear power stations. We protested against cruise missiles, but actually, what killed the nuclear power in the program in the Netherlands was the Chernobyl disaster, much more than our protests. So looking back, at some point I think that I'm not sure how explicit I realized that around this 1980s, but I think it's fair to diagnose that science and technology movement as being quite successful within academia. We got our reforms of the curriculum. Some staff was appointed to explicitly deal with science and society issues.
Okay.
So the success of the Science and Society movement also caused that there were some resource posts in academia where you could do research on innovation or on science and society, and that's where you got your posts.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call it post, because in the beginning it was this very soft money funded research job, but that was very much part of that, you're right. Yeah. But outside, so on the barricades, it was not a big success. So looking back, I think that personally I made a kind of intuitive choice that well, let's make a kind of academic detour. Let's first try to understand better what is happening, what is the relation between science, technology, and society, and then get back to the big political questions. I didn't say that so explicitly to myself, but that I'm pretty sure that that was one of the motivations to get into that research job, get into the history of technology, sociology of scientific knowledge.
But at that moment you were not aware of people working on social studies of science, or that, so that was completely
not at all.
Only discovered that when doing the research.
Yes, discovered when doing the research, particularly discovered by collaborating with Trevor. So it was actually, in that sense, almost literally a detour into academia, and in academia meeting the academic research of the Harry Collinses and the David Bloors and Barry Barnes and Bruno Latours of this world. And there I connected to both that tradition and the history of technology tradition, and my sort of political interests were kept a bit dormant. And then, so to just do the big picture first, then when that had been, I think, quite successful, so the first Twente workshop, then we had a second Twente workshop that resulted in a second book that I edited with John Law. It came out in 1992. Then I started wondering whether it wouldn't be time to end the detour and get back to politics, get back to the barricades.
So unless you were really completely into the theory at first, and that was very successful, then you thought, okay, I want to still do a bit more with the political side. So that was always kind of in the back of your mind?
I think that was in the back of my mind, yes. But only in the back of my mind, because none of the work that we did in those 1980s, early 1990s was explicitly political, and none of the work that I did was explicitly political. But there was that motivation in the back of my mind. And I started raising that question, and even explicitly in the last chapter of the book on bakelite bulbs and bicycles. Well, the title is different, but anyway, something like that.
You were thinking that you were going to go back to the barricades? Is that?
Well, at least in a metaphorical sense, that I wanted again to address issues of the relation between science, technology, and society, and try to answer some of the questions that had haunted me about well, the role of science and technology in society, and how science and technology can be put to better use, include normative questions, political agendas, etc.
So also going outside of academia again?
Going outside of academia, yeah.
And how did you do that?
I guess that quite gradually developed. I didn't make a sort of determined choice, and now I'm going after the politics. It's more that once there were opportunities to do that, I grabbed those opportunities. European projects that allowed me to make that link, addressing more normative questions more explicitly, also in my academic research, and then, for example, when accepting to be president of 4S, and when Sheila asked me to speak on her last presidential plenary at the meeting where I would take over as president, I used that opportunity to argue for a role of STS scholars as public intellectuals, and that is where I sort of spelled out that sort of political program of a role of STS and STS researchers in a wider society.
And how was the community reacting on that? How did they?
I think there are two forms of reaction. One is what they explicitly tell me, and the other is what happens. And I think that what happens is that it just happened, not because I said it, of course, but I think that if you check if you now check the program of annual meetings of 4S, you see lots of links between academic research questions and much more interventionist and practical questions, and they may be in the NGO sphere, or in the state politics sphere, or even in commercial business sphere. in terms of what people told me, almost all the more junior colleagues and PhD students were very happy, and were doing that already. I mean, they didn't need me to say that, but they responded very positively. Some people quite explicitly and well argued say that no, that's none of our business. It's hard work enough to keep this going as a proper academic discipline, keep the quality standards high enough. So let's not meddle with politics. People can do that in their free time. It's a big job to do this in a good scholarly way. So let's keep to the scholarly highway. There is the third group who actually, for example, in consultancy in Washington or in Brussels or wherever, is able to turn STS insights into almost instrumental use, and quite successfully. So I would call that the policy street. So in addition to the academic highway of the people who say, no, let's stick to the scholarly work, there is the policy street where STS insights are actually quite successfully sold to solve problems. One example is that the European Commission adopted at some point concepts like constructive technology assessment that was coined by Arie Rip and Johan Schot in the Netherlands, and which came straight from STS but was adopted in policy circles. But then I'm advocating for the kind of STS boulevard, which combines a motivation in terms of political questions, societal questions, but also tries to keep long-term academic research going. So it's sort of very typical Dutch compromise between the policy street and the academic highway. But I think it can be done.
And would that, I just was wondering, like, if somebody hears that you made a...
So that was then after you...
Oh no, so I'm lost. What was...
Yeah, we're rolling.
And was that talk published?
Yes, I think in 2003 in STHV, Human Science, Technology and Human Values, and the title is something like STSers as Public Intellectuals. I'm not quite sure about the title, but Public Intellectuals is in the title.
And this was a publication that was after your inaugural lecture, because in the meantime I think you became a professor in Maastricht. So you moved also from Twente to Maastricht.
Yes, you're right. You're actually right. I mean, that is you're right. That was in 1995 that I did my inaugural lecture in Maastricht, and that is the moment where I most explicitly made this detour argument and argued for a kind of STS boulevard, and argued for again incorporating a societally inspired agenda, let's put it like that.
And his inaugural lecture is in Dutch, I think, but it's about dikes as well, so it's kind of, it comes back in your career that you're doing research on dikes all the time.
Yes.
Can you tell a bit more about that?
Yeah, the nice thing about Dutch inaugural lectures is that they are meant to spell out to a broader public, so not a public only of your immediate colleagues, but to a broader public, why that chair was established, why you are an appropriate candidate for that chair, and what you think you will be doing in the next 10 years. So an inaugural lecture gives you a nice sort of snapshot of not only the current state, but also at least what that person thinks about what the agenda is. And I used the example of the civil engineers and my father quite explicitly to argue for, to spell out the role of scientists and engineers in shaping society. And I used that example to argue for STSers to study that and also ask the more normative and political questions around that. And actually, you're right, they are typically in Dutch, or they used to be typically in Dutch, but this one is now being translated, and we are going to publish it within a month or 2 months, with other inaugural lectures from our group, to give a kind of overview of what the Maastricht group is doing.
Yeah, because you also played a very important role in shaping the Maastricht group. Because, Can you tell something about?
When we Gerard de Vries asked me to come to Maastricht. He then became professor of philosophy in Maastricht, and he argued that you couldn't do. Gerard was also part of this first Twente workshop in 1984, and he argued that you couldn't do proper philosophy of science and technology if you didn't have that recent empirical work of SSK and Scott on board. So he asked me to become a philosopher, basically. So my first salary in a real teaching position was as a philosopher in Maastricht. And then when I got elected to this newly established chair on technology and society, which was conceived as a social science chair, then we started to develop a broader STS group that now is constituted by historians of technology and historians of science, sociologists, anthropologists, also still philosophers, a few people from the more arts studies side, and that actually led in Maastricht to a research master that is, in a way, is STS plus arts. So it is studying the cultures of arts and science and technology and the relations between them. So in that sense, in Maastricht, we try to move it a little bit further than the 4S definition of what STS is. We include also quite explicitly an empirical studies of the arts.
And what types of research are done there?
All the usual questions of STS, but then what ideally we would hope is that students, when studying a science case or a technology case, would be sensitive to also using a very different kind of sources, cartoons, autobiographies, literary sources that any good STS scholar would do, but we try to sensitize them very early on. One example is a student who studied what happens to an object when it moves from a church to a museum, and so how its identity changes from a religious object to an art object. And he uses an STS perspective, but it is really about objects of arts. So that's the kind of things that happen there. But that's a master program, and after that they can continue into PhD.
Yeah, and the group is now quite big, I think. And it started out very small. So you made it grow, basically.
Yeah, Maastricht is probably the biggest, or certainly one of the biggest STS groups in the Netherlands. And of course, as you know, because you're one of the products of that, in the Netherlands, we from the very beginning, all STS groups in the different universities have collaborated to create one joint Netherlands graduate school. So there are no separate graduate schools in the separate universities, but there is one Dutch STS graduate school, and I was the first coordinator of that graduate school, and Maastricht is still now Karen Bijsterveld, Sally Wyatt will shortly take over. That has been the director of that graduate school. But then that is not only carried by Maastricht, but also by Twente University, Utrecht University, Amsterdam, Groningen, and some other universities. So that is the other big thing in the Netherlands, that we never really fought with each other, but joined forces. And I think that's one of the results, that in terms of per capita, the Dutch are probably the largest constituency in 4S because of this. I think because of the kind of synergetic collaboration that we have in this national graduate school.
Yeah. And after setting that up, you became president for 4S. So you kind of went from local to the more global level.
Yeah, and at the personal level, it was really a blessing, because I had been dean of my faculty until 2000. I think until 2000 for 4 years, and was so involved in doing that so much work, that I was slowly drifting out of research. And I quite vividly remember being at the 4S conference in Tucson, Arizona, and I mean, almost being depressed by how disconnected I felt from what was going on and the discussions there and papers presented. I don't think that I had a paper myself, when I stepped down as dean, I then was asked to run for president, and I got elected. And in a way, that saved my scholarly life, because that helped me to get back and to get connected, and then the research got going again too.
Okay, and then were you then still working on Scott? You were not working on Scott theory anymore, so you were developing new paths of research.
Yeah, Karen Bijsterveld, with whom I worked a lot, she always warns students that they shouldn't think that there is one Scott, that they should think about Scott in an early phase and in a late phase, a blue Scott and an orange Scott or whatever. So definitely the early Scott, as Trevor and I developed it, didn't have any of those explicit normative questions or agenda. I added those in my inaugural lecture, and I still think that I'm very much working, also now, still very much working in a very constructivist style of looking at the world, but I'm hesitant to call it Scott in that narrow sense. But I would always label myself as doing constructivist studies of science, technology, and society. But I suppose that what I'm doing is applying the framework as Trevor and I developed it to, but to more than just artifacts like bicycles. But I now use it also to question social institutions or certain styles of culture or evaluation or whatever.
And how would you describe the 4S when you became president there? What kind of community was it back then?
I think, to be honest, I see a lot of continuity, and I think the only big difference is that it has grown a lot since I was there for the first time at Virginia Tech. I still think that some of the difference that I was then surprised by between the US and Europe, the different cultures are still existing. I think that still American STS is in a way more discipline ordered than in Europe. So in 4S discussions with American PhD students, I often they often ask me about sociology jobs or history jobs. While that is never a question that a Dutch STS person will ask me. Let me only talk about Dutch STS rather than European. Dutch STS PhD graduates consider themselves STS, and they feel comfortable that they could teach a sociology class or a philosophy class if necessary, but they first and foremost have an STS identity. That is different in the US, I think still different, and it was then different, so that is not much of a change. I think there's a clear change in research questions, and I think that is much more attention to political issues, to normative questions. The other thing that I did, together with Wes, who is sitting behind the camera here, during my presidential period, is to argue more quite explicitly for the need to build links to the global south and to incorporate an agenda, to incorporate in our agenda issues that relate to that, try to further push the participation of the global south. There were students from Asia and Latin America, but only very limited, and that definitely is a development in 4S. I mean, symbolized by now doing this interview in Tokyo, the first 4S meeting ever outside Europe or the US. So those are developments, but I would consider them more sort of sustained trends than radical changes. So also in that sense, apart from this sort of personal therapeutic effect that being president had on me, saving, as it were, me, being president felt also quite natural. I continued to function within 4S during the presidency as I did before and as I'm doing afterwards. And maybe that's one of the good things, that presidents only last for 2 years. So they can make a mess and then the new president will correct that. So it's like a Brownian movement. Statistically, 4S will continue and the trend will continue.
And who followed you?
Bruno Latour was the president after me, and I followed Sheila.
Yeah. And this trend within 4S going more global is also reflected in your research?
Yes.
Yeah.
That as these things go, they sound, when I reconstruct my biography, it sounds very logical. That's another way of keeping sane, to tell a story that seems to make sense to oneself. But of course it isn't like that. So I had made that statement, or sort of. So this was not so explicitly in the public intellectuals plenary paper, but 1 year later. When on the plenary, the presidential plenary, I invited Bok Marais from South Africa as a sort of signal that we should sort of open up to those issues. I still wasn't doing that myself very explicitly, but half a year later, I met Shambhu Prasad, with whom I'm still collaborating in India, and then he asked me to come to India and to meet different groups in universities and research institutions. And then I realized, now that I've been saying this at 4S and also in Maastricht about opening up, now here is this invitation. I just can't say no. So I grabbed that opportunity, and that got me going into, you are right, what is now one of the two gravity points in my research, research in and with Indian colleagues and also in Africa. So that's the large part of my research. The other gravity point is actually, that's the other line that also runs through this interview. It's much more explicitly engagement in politics. Well, not politics, but in advising the policy process in the Netherlands and in Europe. And that happened in the same way, that at some point I was asked to chair an advisory committee on nanotechnology. And I realized that, having made this argument about the detour and the need to come back from the academic detour and again engage with society, that I just couldn't say no to an invitation like that. And although I didn't know anything about nanotechnology, but the people inviting me knew that I didn't know anything about nanotechnology. So they made sure that there were members on the committee who would really know what they were talking about, and wanted an STS person to chair and to bring in our STS expertise about the relation between technology and society. So very explicitly there was a recognition. In this case, I'm now talking about the Health Council of the Netherlands. There was a recognition that there is expertise in STS, that expertise needs to be tapped in order to avoid the kind of trouble that Europe got itself into, for example, in the case of biotechnology. And if you would argue earlier in nuclear power, etc. So there is a clear recognition that STS has expertise that needs to be incorporated in basically the broad scientific advisory process.
And this translational process, how is that? How do you experience that, or this process of giving advice? Is that
it's extremely exciting. No, it's wonderful. It's very exciting, and it is just another. It is also just another research site. So I learn a lot from being in such advisory committees. I learn a lot from these nanotechnology scientists then in that committee. As I'm sure they learn from the STS input. Um, and well, say an arrogant way of putting it is that that it confirms everything that we already know as STS about how the relations between science as a profession, science as a discipline, politics, policymakers, the profession of medical doctors, for example, how that works. But it's very interesting to see that played out, and it is actually well, at some point I used the metaphor of holding up a mirror. I think that as an SES person, I held up a mirror to the Health Council. I realized that I'm now making a jump. So let's just put aside this Nanotechnology Advisory Committee for a moment.
What you did, and then after that you were asked to do research on the Health Council, or to make...
Yeah, together with two colleagues, Roland Baal and Ruud Hendricks, we were asked to study the Health Council, and we were asked because the Health Council was going to celebrate its 100th anniversary, and the Health Council thought, well, wouldn't it be nice to have a book that explains how much impact we have. They are too modest to say that they wanted a sort of Festschrift that explains how important they are, but they were sincerely curious about how much impact they have. So the question to us is, do a study. We give you full access to everything, but we would like you to figure out how much impact the Health Council has. We really wanted to do the study because it's a very closed shop. You can't get into it normally, like in the American Academy of Sciences. So they were promising us access. We wanted that, but we were very, very skeptical about this impact question. But we said, yes, okay, let's do it. And we proposed a scheme with 10 case studies, and we said, let's do 5 failed case studies and 5 successful case studies, and then 1 case study being an advisory report that the Health Council had done. Mainly being doctors, they like this sort of design setup with a control group so they like that. And then we said, okay, let's do that, and we'll ask the staff of the Health Council, about 40 very highly qualified researchers in the field of medicine, ecology, toxicology, all PhDs. We said, let's ask them to list to us the 3 most successful advisory reports and the 3 least successful big failures. And let's see. And then we'll select. And then exactly what we had expected and sort of hoped was happening, that some advisory reports were listed as the most successful ones, and that same advisory report was listed by another member as the biggest failure. And so then we could show this to the leadership of the Health Council, the president of the Health Council, and say, well, you see, it's not an unequivocal question what success is. There is something fishy going on. We can't just measure your success. We can't measure your impact. So let's forget about graphs and just asking the question about impact. Let's ask a more constructivist question about how through what processes and strategies the Health Council creates success and sometimes fails to create success. And at that moment, they were just too baffled by the result that it was so obscure what might count as success that they didn't quite. I think they didn't quite understand what we meant, but they didn't have an alternative, so they let go. And that resulted in a book which is now published by MIT, but when in 2009 was published. It was first published in Dutch, and we presented that to the Queen, because this Health Council is a very prestigious body, and when it has its anniversary, then at least when it has its 100th anniversary, then the Queen comes, and so I presented this to the Queen. And I even made in the 12.5 minutes that I had, I made a kind of very brief STS primer, not only to her, but also to the 400 top scientists. But when she shows up, the 400 top scientists show up too. So I gave them a kind of primer on STS. starting with, Majesty, why are you here? This is wrong. We are celebrating an institution that was created 100 years ago. Didn't the world change? It's a dinosaur. It should be out. We should be burying it rather than celebrating it. There must be something wrong. So can't we understand why this organization is still so successful? And then we tried to spell out how it changed its identity and what strategies the Health Council uses to interpret scientific knowledge and translate that and in a way bring it to politics. Now that is now published in 2009 by MIT Press, Paradox of Scientific Authority, and at some point we said, Roland and Ruud and I said to the Health Council, well, what we are doing, we are holding up a mirror to you, meaning that actually we only retell what we hear from you. We don't do anything original. We just interview you, we observe you, we've been in your committees, we have read thousands of documents from your archives, and we just make you look into the mirror, and we look the minister into the same mirror to understand what his Health Council is doing. But then, like all mirrors, they are slightly colored, slightly twisted, they make you look more slim. So it's not innocent. So we do tell a story by holding up the mirror. That is what that book does, trying to understand, also make the Health Council understand, and understand everyone who then sort of looks over the shoulder of the Health Council into that mirror, how that process works. I then realized, I'm still answering your question of minutes ago about the political engagement. The mirror metaphor also has a downside. It has the downside, which is actually quite accurate, that you stay out. Holding up the mirror, it allows you to keep clean hands. You only hold up the mirror and you leave it to the people looking into the mirror to to draw their conclusions, to take their lessons or not, but you're behind the mirror and that's it. So when then the Health Council asked me, because that is the order, we first did this book and then they asked me to chair this nanotechnology committee, then I realized I was going into different business, and that would mean I was going to make, I would be at the other side of the mirror. I was going to make dirty hands. I wouldn't, that was a situation where I couldn't include all the footnotes that I would want to make as an academic. I would need to make compromises. So that's where I think I need another metaphor. So I think that is described by the metaphor of the Sleeping Beauty, where still the most important things are as in the metaphor of the mirror, they are there in that beauty, in that sleeping beauty, but since she's sleeping, she doesn't realize it. Everything she knows and all the strategies and all the skills that they have, both the scientists and the engineers, but also Health Council, the skills that they have to relate to the outside world. But then the prince comes along, the STS person as a prince, kisses her awake, makes her realize everything that she knows, but then stays with her, marries her, rides away on the white horse and stays with her. So makes then the dirty hands come, you together continue. So that's what I'm now doing. So after the nanotechnology committee, I did a committee on the precautionary principle, a committee on biotechnology trends. I'm now doing a new committee on nanotechnology. And I think this is something that someone like Arie Rip, another former president of 4S in the Netherlands, is also quite actively doing as an STS person, engaging with the non-STS world, the non-academic world, and then returning to the academic STS world, reflecting on it, publishing on it. So making your footnotes there, but making dirty hands while, marrying for a while. It's sort of serial marriage marrying for a while, the person with whom you work there.
And how is Dutch society reacting on this marriage with STS?
I think...
Are they picking the lessons up, or do you see any effects, or is that a very slow process?
No, I think... Well, there are several answers. At a very concrete, that's not exactly what you're asking, but it's quite important and relevant. At the most concrete level of jobs, it is not at all difficult for STS graduates to find jobs, and that is partly because of this, because it is increasingly recognized that STS has an expertise beyond just the academia that is valuable. At the very other level, I think Ari once called that the mainstreaming of STS. Some of the ideas of STS have now become so common that it actually starts to become difficult to claim them as being STS. So that may then even be slightly problematic. But at that middle level, I think there is an increasing recognition that STS expertise, like I mentioned in these examples of the Health Council, needs to be incorporated. At this moment, I'm also, for example, involved in organizing a big public debate in the Netherlands about nanotechnologies. That whole idea of organizing a public dialogue on nanotechnologies is very much an STS idea. And they also asked STS persons to help carry that out. So that is a very nice combination of recognizing the substance of the argument that science and technology need to be socially embedded, that you can't develop them you shouldn't have the illusion of developing them in any social vacuum. You should try to incorporate in as early a stage of development as possible debates with users, people who might, or self-proclaimed non-users, or people who might be affected, stakeholders in whatever sense. So in that sense, I think the kind of broad set of STS messages is very well picked up in the Netherlands. And then, of course, there's the usual series of disasters. But then, well, in that sense, the Netherlands is not paradise.
And one of these...
I just want to mention...
Yeah, I saw your signal, but she didn't see, but it's 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah, but and I saw that Niki didn't see that.
I was thinking, shall we still go a bit more into your vulnerability India and stuff, or do you want to skip that?
Are you rolling?
Nice.
Can you...
We're rolling.
One of the studies you were mentioning was the study on the precautionary principle, and that also links up with your research on risk and vulnerability that you're doing now.
Yes. And actually, you're right. Almost all my work now, and that is even something that combines the current research in India and Africa and the more scientific advisory work that I do. I now consider that all related to questions about vulnerability of, say, technological culture, highly developed societies. And that goes back to the period when I was president of 4S, or at least to that period, because that was after 9/11, after the attacks on New York and Washington. The National Science Foundation quite explicitly asked the particularly 4S and SHOT together, those two societies, whether they could think about ways in which STS could contribute to the thinking about the vulnerability of, societies. They were particularly interested in American society. We immediately broadened that, as we are used to doing for us, immediately broadened that to a more international question. There was a workshop at MIT organized by Rosalind Williams and Miriam Levin, that combined people from SHOT and 4S, also the officers. So I was there partly as a researcher, but partly as president. David Hounshell was there also as president of SHOT. And I think that were very fruitful discussions, and though that particular program, that particular plan of NSF in that form didn't really materialize, that did set off my work on vulnerability in Maastricht, and that now resulted in a fairly broad program in which several colleagues like Jessica Messman and Annick Hommels collaborate. And for example, the work in Africa and India is also related to questions about how modern science and technology partly contribute to the vulnerability of those societies. The introduction of, the big dams are a very clear example of how, on the one hand, they were originally designed to help solve irrigation problems and energy problems, but at the same time, literally kill tribal communities in the valleys that are flooded because of these big dams. So, and say the high-rise buildings in New York, if they hadn't been there, or if there hadn't been planes, there couldn't have been the 9/11 attacks. So the science and technology is partly created to help solve the vulnerability of human settlements, but they also create new vulnerabilities. That's the core STS idea, and that's what we're doing in India and Africa, related to a variety of technologies, nanotechnology, but also handloom weaving or non-pesticide forms of agricultural management, water management, etc.
Yeah, and you're focusing mostly on India.
And the focus is mostly on India, and now increasingly also on Africa. So there is that started with a comparative European project that will finish in 2011. Which develops with the Indians and with the Africans an Indian manifesto on science and technology and an African manifesto on science and technology. In both cases, the typical STS question being, what could be an agenda for science and technology that is rooted in that particular culture and that reflects the culture and the political choices and the norms of that society, but still links to the global, say, universal ideals of science and technology. That's one project, and the other project is funded by the Dutch Research Council with 4 PhD students and 2 postdocs, and that is exclusively on nanotechnology, but again asking how that is developed and how the risk management is done in Africa and in India, and is asking the question how in those different kinds of political cultures and scientific and technical cultures, how forms of democratic risk governance of nanotechnology could be developed.
And carry on.
So if people would like to read something of your work and they don't want to read all the things you've written, what would you advise them to read then?
I still think what came to be known as the school bus book, the book that we talked about, that Trevor and Tom Hughes and I edited in 1987, that is known as the school bus book because of its color and its yellow-black striping. I still think it's worth going back to that because of the kind of strange heterogeneity that it has, but it also reflects some of the excitement of the field at that moment. Actually, to be honest, you can have a lot of criticism to that volume because to some extent it's much too scattered, but that scatteredness also is quite, I think it reflects the excitement of that day, and we are trying to do a second edition with a new introduction. I'm not, at the moment of this interview, I'm not sure whether that will happen. If it happens, it'll be published in 2012, we hope. So that is one thing that I would mention, and then I definitely would hope that people would turn to the 3B book, Bicycles, Bakelite and Bulbs, and to the book about the paradox of scientific authority. And we mentioned other things, but I'll stick to those 3 books.
Okay. And in terms of the future, we've now talked about 4S and its development and continuities that you saw, and trends developing. And what do you think are important things for the future?
I think that the way that we talked about it very much represents what I think will happen, and also what I like to see happening, a continuation of the trends. I also realized that the way that we talked about it, I almost conflated the society 4S with the broader STS field and community. Now, if I briefly narrow it now, your question, to think about 4S as a society, I hope it will continue to be the kind of broad church, very hospitable home to an extremely broad range of scholarly interests, with elements like, which I think we cherish here, and other societies don't do like that, that we deliberately try to have, for example, PhD presentations, not separately in a kind of separate box of PhD presentations, but just scattered around the program, and to continue with that openness and style. But I would hope that the society might, when recognizing some of the increased presence of STS in different national societies, might also gain a bit more confidence to operate as a society, and that, for example, I mean, at this moment of the interview, we are in the aftermath of the oil rig spill in the Mexican Gulf, which evidently, and perhaps even more importantly, the Pakistan floods affecting millions of people in Pakistan. Evidently, there are lots of STS issues. There probably, let's take Pakistan, there probably are more STS issues than issues of climate change involved. And no doubt, at some point, individual STS researchers will turn to it and will produce very, very valuable publications about it. I'm wondering whether at some point the 4S Society would be able to develop mechanisms to, at such an event, speak up and offer STS expertise in some structured form to either the general public and public debate, or to policymakers, and so somehow as a society create mechanisms to quickly organize some expertise, get together a group of people who would sit there for half a year, write a report, and then present that with the stamp and the peer-reviewed quality of the society. That we would need to do that very carefully, but I think that is quite possible, and it certainly would fit with the broader trend in the STS field as I see them happening, and as I hope will continue in the future.
I hope so as well.
In 100 years, do you think, I always have to ask the 100-year question. In 100 years, if somebody's watching this tape, is there anything that you would like to say to them? I mean, my goal is to preserve tapes through my lifetime, and then I'm hoping they're going to make it 100 years by putting them in archives. And I think it'll work, but you never know. So if they are watching it in 100 years, you can say hi to your mom if you want, but you know.
I find that an impossible question. I mean, I'm too much of an engineer. I'm too much of a I too immediately see all the obvious impossibilities of answering that question. I once was asked by, that was around 2000. I mean, everyone was asked to do that kind of thing. And I escaped by not predicting the future in terms of change and trends and everything, but by trying to make a careful statement of what I was pretty sure that would never change in the world. So then since you didn't ask me to predict anything, but you asked me to ask something of the people, then I would ask them, well, in what you saw in this interview, so I should look into the camera now, so in what you saw in this interview, what now is still the same? And my prediction is that what still will be the same is that it's these basic social interactions between human beings that is governing the world. And that is, well, ultimately it's love, but then also its negative side and the fighting and the hatred. But ultimately that is determining the development of science and technology and societies with it. So ask yourself, is that still the case now?
And just at the moment that you said that, it told me to change the battery pack.
Brilliant. So if it's out,
You see, it was answering. It was actually answering.